Welcome to Think Ahead, the podcast from London Business School that brings you cutting-edge research, real-world insights, and expert analysis to help business leaders navigate today's most pressing challenges. I'm Sergei Guriev, professor of economics and dean at London Business School. Today, I'm joined by two brilliant guests, Anja Lambrecht and Greg Crawford. Anja is a professor of marketing at London Business School. Greg is a chief economist at Zalando and professor of economics at the University of Zurich. Together, we'll explore how organizations can build agility and resilience in the face of growing complexity. From data overload to digital consumer behavior and the rise of artificial intelligence, we'll unpack what that means for firms and how the firms can respond strategically. Anja and Greg, welcome to Think Ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's dive in. Let's set the stage by exploring the drivers of complexity: data proliferation, digital consumer behavior, the rise of artificial intelligence, and how firms respond to this. So what does that complexity and the rise of digital consumers look like for firms today? Anja.
Yeah, Sergei, that's a really interesting question. And I think multiple things are happening at the same time. So on the one hand, you have increased range of data, right? Just the mere type of data points firms can collect has exploded over time. So on individual consumers, we can get a lot more insights on their preferences, on their behavior. Firms can collect data, for example, on their web browsing behavior, keep that data across a long time, and build really comprehensive understanding of customers. But at the same time, firms are also able to target consumers, be it on their websites, to personalize content on the websites, be it targeting through emails, to really give consumers the information that's relevant to them. And in some way, if you take a step back and think of it in a broader marketing context, it really is about understanding consumer segments and all niche consumers as well as more mainstream consumers. So the ability to then actually talk to those niche consumers is really what has changed when we look from the traditional offline market to a more digital market.
Yes, Greg, you, like Anja and myself, are an academic who worked on big data sets, but now your day job is actually to do exactly what Anja was talking about. You work at Zalando, which is a large online fashion retailer, so niche consumers are by definition your customers, and your job is actually to address those issues on your day job. How do you handle those challenges? How does Zalando address this issue of segmenting markets, identifying niche consumers, and selling to them?
Well, so speaking of, we face exactly the specific example of the general trends that Anja was talking about. Yeah. So of course we have over 50 million customers. Yeah, but everyone has different tastes when it comes to fashion. So it's, I may like this jacket, you may like that jacket. Even though we're demographically similar, we might have very different tastes in clothes, yeah? And so we begin by recognizing that we do have information about our consumers, but they're also very busy, right? So attention is a real challenge. Getting consumers' attention and engaging with them, in essence, making their online fashion shopping experience convenient, right? We want to show them the assortment, the fashion that's relevant for them. And we want to give them a convenient payment experience. We want to give them a convenient delivery experience. We were one of the big innovators in Europe with free returns to make it easy for customers to try clothing on and return it without having the worry that they'd ordered something wrong. So this is the context that we're working in. And at the same time, there's another big trend, of course, AI and Gen AI has come. And this is really changing the way companies like ours think about solving problems. I have to say, though, not only AI, and as we'll dig deeper later in the podcast here, other tools also matter, right? So in particular, causal inference matters in ways that I can illustrate with examples later on.
No, I just wanted to follow up on your point, right? You might like a different jacket than the Sergei does, right? And in a way, you have, let's take an even larger category, T-shirts, right? So I checked, Zalando has 87,000 T-shirts, more than 87,000 T-shirts available. And so if I or Sergei or you, Greg, go to the website and search for T-shirts, you're not going to look at 87,000 T-shirts, presumably, right? So you guys have to make the decision which T-shirts to show to consumers and how to rank those T-shirts. And that's a really hard problem to solve. And so I think one of the tools that have become increasingly important is to test that, right? To test for consumers or segments of consumers what type of, in that case, T-shirt should be shown in what position. And so I think, to go back to your earlier question, Sergei, right, how is this landscape really changing? It's having the data and granular consumer needs, but also the ability to test and to figure out what actually is it, what individual consumers like.
So that's exactly what we are going to discuss now. In a day job of a chief economist or a chief marketing officer of an online company, digital company, and you both studied those companies and consulted those companies, what empirical tools you're using? And I guess we'll also talk not just about AI, but also about other tools. And again, definition of AI in this space is very vague because we used to call it machine learning, and we use machine learning. We were quite happy with that, but now everybody's talking about AI. In practice, what are the empirical tools that the companies are using?
Yeah, so one tool that's really important is experimentation, or sometimes referred to as A/B testing. So let's assume Greg wants to send out an email to customers and offer a 10% discount. I think you guys should be doing that, actually, right?
I will take 15.
15 for the deans.
We have to see what the data says.
So how does he know whether Greg should send out no discount, a 10% discount, or a 15% discount? So what Greg might do is take all consumers and put them randomly into different groups. And then one group just gets an email saying, hey, this is the newest collection. A second group gets an email saying, that's the newest collection, and you get a 10% discount. And the third group gets an email, this is the new collection, and you actually get a 15% discount. And so then by comparing the relevant outcome variables, such as did somebody purchase? How much did they spend? You can figure out whether Sergei should get a 15% discount or maybe a 10% one. And you can do that across all customers or by customer groups. A little spin to that actually is from all my experience, consulting with and working for companies, that in many instances, these tests and considerations are done short term. Mm-hmm. So for example, did I respond? Did I purchase that week? Did I purchase that month? The long-term implications, figuring that out, is actually much, much harder.
Yeah.
But you have data on consumers for a long run, right? Because you track your consumers, you have longitudinal data sets, you can actually see the dynamic implications of choices made today on the responses in the next experimentation. So in principle, you can do much more than the simple A/B testing randomized control trial. You can actually construct complex experiments if you wish. Right?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I would pick up on this. I mean, of course, we're always interested in the short run effect and the long run effect, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I see my job is to trying to help Zalando maximize the long run value of Zalando as a platform. Mm-hmm. And of course, for that, you need long run effects, right? But there's always a challenge running experiments, trying to identify long run effects. You either need to run long-term experiments, which you of course can do, right? But that takes time and it comes at cost. And so there's also a lot of work trying to identify proxy variables that are good, if you like, surrogates for long-run value, that we can try to measure the impact of short-run experiments on long-run outcomes by looking at the impact on these short-run proxies.
Can you provide an example of a proxy for a long-term effect?
So the classic one, I think one that matters a lot for us certainly is order frequency, right? So we talk, like many companies, about customer lifetime value. We try to maximize customer lifetime value. And customer lifetime value is essentially the string of profits and from the various products and services we offer, whether that's fashion that they purchase or advertising on our platform, or we're now investing in inspiration and entertaining content, right, which will also foster advertising revenue. And so if you think of these as sort of flows to the platform, we want to measure this at the customer level over a long period, right? But so that's often, it's going to tie then to either order frequency or visit frequency or time on site. These are some of the classic KPIs or key performance indicators for trying to get a short-run read on longer-run outcomes.
And these are not new. If you go back in the marketing literature, direct marketing literature, 20 years, 30, probably even 40 years ago, you talked about RFM models, recency, frequency, monetary spend, and that was maybe in a catalog type of ordering setting. But what we can see here, it still matters, right? It's exactly the metrics you worry about today.
But that's totally true. But what is different is we are now able to evaluate how effective are these proxies, right? So we have much more evidence that we can then use to inform, okay, how much weight should we give on this proxy versus another, right? And so that, I think, that's a change that's been brought about by this increase in available data and methods that allow us to answer those kinds of questions.
And there are, of course, much more data, and it's easier to track customers if we compare it to the situation with catalog orders and overall surveys of customers over their lifetime. I have a question about those long-term proxies. What is long-term for you? You are talking about lifetime value, but what is the long-term? What is short-term?
I mean, it's often context-dependent, right? So if you're thinking of something like engagement, then it might be, visits per week, visits per month. I mean, we're not like a social media platform like TikTok or Facebook, right? Where their goal is daily engagement. We're a fashion platform where, of course, we want to engage and inspire our customers, but if they're coming to purchase fashion, they don't often do that daily, right? So it's longer term for us is measured rather on the months or years time scale for purchases, but for our content that's seeking to engage customers, then it is more shorter term, more like days and weeks.
Right. So let's delve in other tools. And we wanted to talk about causal inference, structural models. And Anja, you consult companies, you teach business school students. Greg, you need to talk to internal stakeholders. And I'm sure that you have language to explain those complex concepts to people who are not necessarily PhDs in economics or marketing. When we say you can now use AI, you just ask ChatGPT to spit out answers to whatever questions we ask. Of course, A/B testing, randomized control trials are easy to explain. People get this idea when we test drugs and we use placebos, we have control group, treatment group. This is something that people get. But once you start talking about more complex tools, how are they used in business today? And how do you explain that to people who are not PhDs?
Yeah, maybe let me just start with an anecdote, and then I'm sure Greg can add as well. I talked to just yesterday to a chief economist of another firm, and who they're doing at that place a lot of experiments, and I said, how do you use AI? And he said, well, we do tests and control, and we use AI to speed up the coding, essentially, right? So I think, it's a very mundane use, but it's important in that it just increases efficiency, and to the extent that testing really in many digital firms has evolved to that flywheel that allows to optimize growth and optimize growth based on optimized growth, that is actually not negligible, right? I think the other question then is, how can you use AI as a tool to really improve performance, right? And I think you have one example, Greg, you want to talk about.
So this is super segue so I work quite a bit on the question of that Anja brought up earlier. What assortment should we offer on our platform, right? And it's a question that's relevant for every company, right? And it's important to recognize that carrying assortment has costs, right? For us, there's costs in the warehouse, but even for digital firms, let's say a Netflix or a Google that are offering digital services, too much assortment or too much content can be confusing to the customer. It can contribute to a cluttered customer experience. So there's always going to be a trade-off on how much assortment is the right amount, right? And of course, as we were talking earlier, experimentation is absolutely possible. For example, I know a story of a big travel platform that was interested in understanding how important one of their big hotel partners was to the platform. And so, of course, they ran an A/B test and sort of hid that hotel partner from the search results to see how consumers responded, right? And against for one group of customers, and then for another group of customers, they kept it as normal, right? And then they could look at the difference in customer behavior. Did they switch to other hotels? Did they leave the platform? Right? And this was an important insight that let them gain understanding of how important this business partner was to their business, right? So, I mean, we have to be careful with that kind of thing with us because, of course, there's always guardrails in place. It's costly to run experiments. And especially even if we were able to snap our fingers and run every experiment, it's the scale of the problem is enormous, right? And so we're always looking to complement experimental methods with other methods. And you mentioned structural models, and this sounds very complicated, but it's not really. It's we basically try to build in this assortment space a very simple model of consumer choice. So, for example, suppose you bought that jacket online. I don't know if you did or I don't know if you didn't, but there are people buying jackets like that online all the time, yeah? And if you chose that jacket online, you probably looked at a few others, yeah? And so we would then build a model of your choice of jackets. And from that model, when we can take advantage of the everyday comparisons that consumers like you and others make across jackets. And if that jacket beat two others that you were looking at, it's going to have a higher value to you. If you aggregate that up across many millions of consumers, you can get a ranking of the attractiveness of all the jackets. And that's basically a structural model. Yeah? The structural model is super helpful in two ways. First, we can use it to think about doing things that we wouldn't feel comfortable doing in an experiment. From the model, predict what would happen to sales based on all the comparisons consumers made across other jackets.
Because you can see what did they compare it to, what was the next option that they maybe clicked on and spent time on but didn't end up purchasing,
and
right?
the characteristics of those jackets.
Well, not yet. I'll come to that. That comes next.
But you basically have a model of preferences, right? Yeah. You have a model of preference where you say, okay, Sergei likes a certain
For the listeners who cannot see that, I just wear a gray business suit that people like me probably should buy online.
No, they're available online, Sergei. Don't you worry. But the second key thing about these structural models is they scale beautifully, right? You can see right away. Then the scope, you can imagine all kinds of different thought experiments that you might run, and the model will be able to tell you that. Now, the cool thing is that you can actually combine these methods, right? So experimentation is the gold standard. It gives you the most reliable results, but it doesn't scale so easily. Structural models scale, but you always have some concern about the validity compared to really an A/B test from an experiment. But you can use both tools to benchmark against each other and inform each other. And that's really where you get the best of both methods. So you get trustworthy insights at scale.
And then you have 87,000 T-shirts at Zalando, right? So presumably that you don't want to show Sergei 87,000 T-shirts, but you get a sense of what characterizes T-shirts, right? And that's where the AI comes in,
exactly.
Right? And you can use AI to measure features through embeddings, features of T-shirts. So then you can extrapolate from preferences. Well, you can think about preferences for features, and you can extrapolate from one T-shirt to the next T-shirt, right, Greg?
Exactly. And because everything I was describing earlier, it's fabulous, but it works only for the assortment that's already on the platform.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But of course, companies are always interested, what should we offer next? Mm-hmm. And even in the fashion industry, even if we know, hey, these are the strong brands, what's the kind of fashion that's going to be fashionable? Right? And so the idea is then to use the results from this first round to try to understand, well, what characteristics of these jackets or T-shirts are particularly important? Was it the brand? Was it the material? Was it the
color,
the silhouette? And now there's so many potential characteristics. You have to summarize that information in some way. And that's where the AI comes in. AI is fabulous. It's synthesizing information. So Anja was talking about embeddings. Embeddings are just sort of shorthand metrics that allow companies like ours to position products in space to understand that, hey, that jacket actually isn't like this jacket, therefore let's not necessarily show them both to the same customer. We'll show that jacket to the customers that like that kind and this jacket to the customers that like this kind. And the beautiful thing is you can do that first on your on-site data, but then if you can measure those same features, those same colors, etc., colors, silhouettes, brands, for products that aren't yet on the platform or that have even are from that are coming into the market, you can say, aha, that's what's going to sell for us.
And so, and in some way, what the beauty is here, right? So you go back to really classic marketing problems, right? So marketing, we talk about the 4 Ps: product, price, place, and promotion.
Mm-hmm.
And a place tends to be very difficult to experiment on. So let's put that on the side for now. But you talk about product, about price and promotion, and you can use all those tools together, experimentation and structural models and AI, to actually give much better, more fine-grained answers to those very classic questions. And going back to my earlier point, even break this down for particular customer segments, which once we are on that digital marketplace or, Zalando's websites, I can show a different assortment to Sergei and to Greg because I know you guys like different type of jackets. And that's in some way the place comes in. You can almost think about the ranking algorithm that determines the order by which products are being shown as part of the place, right? Of how present is that product. And so I think it's really great because we can solve problems that have been there for a long time for much more granular segments and in a much better way.
So let me ask a question. You mentioned validity, you mentioned place. I think these are very important and related issues. So you run experiments, you build a structural model, you calibrate the model, you empirically identify the magnitudes of those parameters. So gray should be 10% more expensive or more valuable than blue or whatever it is. But then those parameters are tested on your, say, German market. Can you actually be sure that there is validity for the UK market, right? You mentioned place, and you said place is harder. Or you need to run an experiment and validate a new model for another place, another category of consumers. And the related question, which is actually the same question, Anja mentioned niches which are getting smaller and smaller. You have 50 million customers. What is the niche? What is the unit of analysis? 1 customer, 1,000 customers, 2,000 customers? How do you segment the market so you have to meet this challenge of having enough data in the niche on one hand? On the other hand, still, if it's a niche which is too big, you don't reach your Saint Graal.
So look, I think these are super questions, and they're the kinds of real-world trade-offs that I, as an economist inside a company, face every day, right? And so let's take first the second question, right? How many is enough customers to get valid insights? It really is. There's a trade-off decision, so it's context dependent, right? So if you have more customers, you can get stronger insights faster, right? And so every experiment takes time, and of course the goal is to have trustworthy insights as fast as possible. So you might if you really need insights fast, then you're going to have to use a larger customer group, right? It also relates to the other point you mentioned, which is if we do an analysis in Germany, is it relevant in the UK? So ideally, we would do a German analysis in Germany and a UK analysis in the UK, right? But we again face these kind of trade-offs where maybe one of our smaller markets just isn't big enough to run the analysis that we can run in one of our bigger markets, right? And so then what you can do, of course, is you can estimate whatever effect you're interested in the larger market, and then be very clear. And this is really, you came back to communication earlier, be very clear with stakeholders to say, look, here in Germany, we have very reliable results. We have good confidence. I know we're interested in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the data aren't rich enough yet. We only rolled out in these markets a few years ago. It takes more time to grow the customer base. what we can say is we can look at historical differences between the German customer and the Eastern European customer and then say, okay, based on those historical differences, this is how we're going to adapt the German number for Eastern Europe. And that's then a very clear assumption that is the best evidence you can provide, and you can give that to commercial stakeholders and they can act on it. But they can also say, I need more confidence. And then we say, okay, if you need more confidence, we get it. We can then try to use other methods that will take more time, of course, to give you that greater confidence. So it's a trade-off, always.
Yeah, I think it's a trade-off. And I think also if your group of customers is very small, right? So the question becomes how reliable are your results and how generalizable to both the larger group, but also to the future. So if you observe one fairly small group of customers at one specific point in time and try to extrapolate to their future behavior, the future interests, say in terms of what products to show in which order in the ranking results, you may be more likely to get this wrong than if you are based on a larger group of customers. So there is this temptation or the ability to narrow it down on a very small group, but that's not always better. So I would say it's important to find this trade-off. On the one hand, you want to target a smaller group, and on the other hand, that may actually not help. But let me give you another context. So what we've seen in the last 5 years, 10 years, is in some sectors really an explosion of brands. Think about cosmetics. The number of new cosmetics brands have been launched in the 5 or 10 years is frankly mind-boggling. Or think about craft beers. So the number of craft beer brands has been launched, especially in the US, but also in Europe, is stunning. So why is it possible suddenly? Why do we have this launch of so many different brands across sectors, actually, that now seem to be thriving versus 20, 30 years ago, there were a few brands. It was a very stable market. Well, for all these new brands, the ability to reach out to new media, through new media, to specific segments is massive, right? And that moves away from Zalando having lots of data. These guys might not even have tons of data. But the fact that now to launch a brand and popularize a brand, you don't just need to run a TV ad, which is hugely expensive, and it's going to be shown to lots of people who will never be interested in your product. But instead, what you can do is you run a TikTok campaign. You might be running advertising on search and on Meta, other different platforms, but you can be targeting specific groups, and that could be targeting based on demographics, but that could be targeting based on interests, much more important than demographics, based on interests and behavior. And so, taking this outside of the view of a large company like Zalando, for entrepreneurs and young brands, this offers a huge opportunity to growth, to launch and to grow.
They can do one more thing, though, especially the beauty brands. They can reach out to us and distribute across Europe on our fashion, beauty, and lifestyle platform.
Exactly, but when are you going to take on those brands when they have a brand name?
Yeah.
Right? So in many instances.
That's one of those questions that we have to look at.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say, to launch it, to get to that point, they are, I'm sure you might be taking on others. I'm not, saying here what Zalando does. But it facilitates that launch.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So privacy is one of the barriers to adopting the modern empirical technology for improving customer experience. What are the other problems and barriers for investing in those technologies, for using them?
Yeah, I think a big question to me is always, why don't more firms use those technologies? Especially, why don't more firms test? You can argue building a structural model is very complicated. Implementing AI, depending on what you do, can be rather complicated as well. But really, running an A/B test shouldn't be that hard. Everybody has engineers. Those engineers can implement A/B testing, and many firms test, as I said earlier, constantly. So why don't all firms test constantly, right? If that allows you to constantly optimize and increase your revenues, it would be rational for everybody to constantly test. At least, I say everybody, I'm referring to firms in the digital space where this is much easier to implement than in brick and mortar business. And so one barrier I have seen, is really related to how management thinks about testing. So the extent to which management is aware of the need of testing and supports that, both emotionally, so to speak, right? Giving the right backing, but also in terms of resources, IT resources to run those tests. But most importantly, when the results come in of a test, do firms act on those? Firms act on those. That sends a signal. We value that, and we have a risk-free environment. We take your results, we act on those, and you can test again. We're not necessarily immediately, going to cut out that unit because you found a result that demonstrates that a certain marketing channel is more or less effective than in others, but instead we are willing to continue testing. The other point related to having to continue to test is, many firms, about 1/3 of tests show a maximum of 1/3 of tests show a result. We actually find a positive effect. I don't know how it's for Zalando, right? So some firms have 1/3 negative, 1/3 nothing, 1/3 positive. Sometimes it's even less. Yeah. And so the willingness to keep testing, even though you don't find an incremental benefit, is really important. Because frankly, if you were always finding incremental benefit, you wouldn't need to test.
Exactly. The fact that sometimes you find negative effects, I think, is reasonable because obvious choices should be made without testing. Tests are, as you said, expensive. So it's normal that when we test, sometimes our beliefs are actually not confirmed, our expectations are not satisfied, and the management's stereotypes are actually challenged.
Yeah. Let me share that I think the number, if you look in the sort of experimentation community, is more like 10 to 20%, not 30%, not 33%.
Yeah, it depends by firm.
Of course.
I'm
sure it's
being positive, you mean?
Positive, 10 to 20% positive results. So you have to run 10.
Well, I think it also depends if you're very early in the cycle of testing, you have a higher probability to improve, right? And if you're late in the cycle, it's getting harder and harder to actually get incremental benefits.
But let me also build on Anja's answer to why we don't see more of this. And I do think leadership is critically important, because I think to change a company's way of decision making away from the old-fashioned, hey, at some level everyone's familiar with how is a decision made? The decision is made by the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, right? But if you want to move to a data-driven culture of decision making, it really requires a change in really organizational thinking, right? So this is really a culture change problem. And so I think when you think about, well, how do you do that? Well, first, as a necessary input, you need to have the right, if you like, portfolio of skills within the firm. So we talked about a range of different scientific methods, right? Experimentation, structural methods, AI tools, right? But to be honest, even more important than those scientific tools, even among the scientists, are good communication skills. Because a scientist that has a particular way to solve a problem can't have impact unless it can communicate those skills to the commercial leaders that are ultimately making the decisions. And so you need these scientists, but you also need engineers, you need product managers, and you need these communication skills to learn from the commercial leaders that have decades of experience, right? And so, like, we're talking about all these data skills, but the data skills can only be effective if they're put in, if they're used appropriately given the context of that firm, right? So there's a real matching problem between commercial leaders and, if you like, technical leaders, whether it's from the science, product, or engineering perspective, and that's really what I see as one of the big hurdles to the adoption of these tools.
What both you and I are saying is a lot comes down to culture, right? And so culture implies organizational structure. It implies incentives. So what are you compensating people on at the end, evaluating and compensating people on at the end of the day? It includes skill. It includes what tasks are you actually prioritizing, and who makes decisions, and what are actually the rules based on what decisions should be made. So I would say that for a successful let's say, test and learn organization, right? And there are all these other technologies that come in there. If the culture isn't aligned, you can have all the tech people you want. It's not going to go anywhere.
I have a question on senior leaders. You talked about senior commercial leaders with decades of experience. Many of them went to school decades ago, right? When structural models were not used, A/B testing existed, but not necessarily used in the marketing space. AI wasn't there. They didn't get classes on machine learning. To what extent there's shortage of skills? Suppose there is no lifelong learning executive education provided by top business schools to those leaders. Suppose some leaders don't take classes from London Business School. So to what extent a lack of skills of those leaders is also a barrier to making the right choices?
So
I'll let you take that.
So I think that, skills is always, of course, important. But as a leader, you don't actually need to be able to implement an AI tool or run a structural model or actually know how to instruct your IT guys or programmers what exact A/B tests to run. And so that's where I think culture comes in. So the willingness or the key part is to understand the importance of data-based decision-making and what type of tools can actually lead to these right decisions. So you don't have to have that detailed training. Of course, we offer a lot of training, right? But I think it's ultimately more in the mindset. And if the right prioritization is done, then hiring the right people, setting up the type of organization that supports and encourages testing, has a risk-free environment, that's ultimately what is key.
But let me follow up on that, because I think I agree with everything you just said, Anja. But so I go every year there's an economist in tech. So I'm an economist, but there's many applied scientists in tech, and so there's an annual economist in tech meeting every year in Seattle or San Francisco, and at this meeting it's very interesting as someone who's not in one of the big companies that innovated in this space, say 10, 15 years ago. I have in mind here Amazon, Meta, Uber, Netflix, So that's where the economists from all those companies are coming to the conference. They're like, why doesn't everybody do this, right? Why, and I think that's sort of the genesis of your question, Sergei, is I really think senior leaders don't necessarily know what they don't know. Right? And
But that's why I'm trying to say you don't necessarily need the detailed tech training. The important bit is to understand the benefits, and then you can support and nourish an organization like that and hire people like you.
I agree, but I'm saying they don't know that they know that they need those skills.
Yeah.
I think I would...
Yes, I think we're saying the same thing in a different way.
As a CEO, I would agree with Anja that CEOs should push their colleagues, challenging them and telling them, look, you actually don't know this and you need to learn this. And you only think that you don't need to learn, but actually you do. So I think this is a cultural piece. It's how leadership works in an organization. So unfortunately, we are running out of time, but each episode is concluded with a signature question, which is today, thinking ahead, how can business leaders build agile organizations that can thrive in this data-rich environment?
Realize the growth that can come from using that data and instill a data and test-driven culture in the entire organization.
And I'll build on that. These tools are really an unbelievable capability that can provide essentially an innovation engine for the company. It superpowers business decision-making. And so thinking ahead, any firm that is interested in building a competitive advantage and succeeding relative to their rivals should really think hard about adopting these methods.
Thank you, Anja. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, our audience, for joining us on this episode of Think Ahead. As consumer preferences fragment and decision-making accelerates, agility and strategic foresight and data analysis are no longer optional, they're essential. We hope that this episode has sparked fresh thinking about how your organization can build resilience and innovation into its core. We'd love to hear from you how your organization is navigating complexity and using data to drive innovation. Does your business use data-driven decision-making? Please share your thoughts on Spotify or YouTube using the hashtag ThinkAhead. To stay connected with the latest insights from our faculty and global business leaders, please visit london.edu/think. And don't forget to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, please keep thinking ahead.